You're listening to Decisive Point. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and are not necessarily those of the Department of the Army, the U.S. Army War College, or any other agency of the U.S. government. I'm in the studio today with Colonel Rich Butler, Director of the China Landpower Study Center, and Josh Arostegui, Chair of the China Landpower Study Center. Butler and Arostegui are co-authors of Building a Purposeful Research Agenda. You can find it in the spring 2024 issue of Parameters. Look for Volume 54, Issue 1. Welcome back to Decisive Point. It's good to be in the studio with you again.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's great to be here again.
This installment of the Classic Director's Corner addresses the Center's research agenda. Josh, what is the Center's study, and what are its relationships with other organizations?
The Center really focuses on understanding the Chinese military's application of land power, or even just understanding the People's Liberation Army and the Air Force Airborne Corps, the People's Armed Police, just a whole host of military forces within China's land domain, as well as understanding the application of Chinese land power within the joint construct, or even how the Chinese would use land power to accomplish certain national security objectives. So it's a pretty broad set of topics that we get after. But historically speaking, there haven't been a lot of people that have looked at this particular subject. Mentors of mine, Dennis Blasco, Larry Wurtzel, we would call them the graybeards that looked at these types of topics. And I've really tried to model my own research after what they went after. But the fact is, so much has changed in recent years, and the Chinese military has really modernized immensely. And nobody is really looking at this en masse. Whereas we have counterpart centers within the professional military education system, such as the China Aerospace Studies Institute under Air University, and the China Maritime Studies Institute under the Naval War College, and even National Defense University. They have folks who have been looking at their own particular domains and those services that fall within those domains. So for us, we're going to be focusing on not only just the PLA Army, but the Airborne Corps that falls under the People's Liberation Army Air Force. We're going to look at the People's Armed Police. We're going to touch on those topics that typically don't get looked at from other service centers. Mainly because, in my personal opinion, the Chinese military is still very ground-centric. I know a lot of it's changing, but the senior leaders within the Central Military Commission and the Joint Theater Commands under the PLA are Army still. And so this is something that I think is a big gap that our community is missing a better understanding of, and I want to make sure we get after that.
Rich, what does applied research reveal for the U.S. and its allies and partners?
We hope, first of all, that it explains and has the explanatory power of being able to better understand what the People's Liberation Army is up to on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. It is not a state army, it's a party army. And they clearly have designs on what they would like to do with that strategic land power throughout the region and across the world to secure their interests. No different than what we've done a lot of study on at the other PME institutions of what their naval service does and what their air service does. But the ground forces being the largest component of the PLA means that where they go, it has staying power. And it operates in other people's sovereign territory all of the time because that's where people live. And unless you're operating in a place like Antarctica where there are no countries, you're operating in someone's sovereign terrain where everyone's most vital interests are. If you begin to understand that problem, then you are better informed of what you should be doing about it. So the day-to-day campaigning activity that we do in the military lane as the United States military, we get a better understanding of what we should be doing to counter that from both an assurance and a deterrence standpoint. From the assurance standpoint, it means that we put our strategic land power in places of utility where we send clear signals to our allies and our partners throughout the region that we stand with them, that we will help defend their sovereign spaces, that we understand and are empathetic to the needs of their vital interests that overlap with ours because we're all part of the free and open Indo-Pacific. We also put ourselves in a position to deny key and decisive terrain to the PLA that's seeking that benefit to flip the rules-based international order from the military perspective to provide the access and the utility and the availability to deploy and do operations in other people's nations. That in turn has a deterrent effect because we're out there not just showing the flag, but we're actually doing campaigning that gives pause to the CCP and what they might want to use their army for. And that's not just in the land domain. Because if you're controlling key and decisive terrain in archipelagic space, islands, waters, that you can control sea space. Long-range precision fires, the ability to target from land, ships and aircraft over common terrain and contested air and maritime space in places like the South China Sea, all has a significant deterrent effect that defends our allies and our strategic partners up and down the first island chain, out through the second island chain, even around to India and up to the Alaska border. It also allows us to look at the campaigning level. Who else is the PRC working with? Who are they colluding with? How are they working with other authoritarians? And we see some of that going on in the Ukraine right now, where military and second use hardware is going to the Ukraine. The Chinese are buying cheap products from Russia, particularly petroleum products and natural resources, at a cut rate deal because it avoids the fiascos of the Russians trying to deal with Europe at this point. So this all comes together when you look at how does that pacing challenge of the 21st century and that key economic and political entity that we call the PRC, how are they working when colluding with other authoritarian states? Because I think that also tells us some things about what the future holds in terms of how we defend our vital interests, because that authoritarian collusion is a very different problem than we've dealt with the last many years. So I think we can learn a lot by studying the idea that we put strategic land power at the focal point of what we study and figure out how we understand how we work better with our joint forces and how we build a better force that's prepared to defend American interests with key allies and partners and assure and deter as we go forward.
Your article has a pretty robust list of goals. I think it's 10 of them. How do you prioritize these?
Honestly, this is a tough one because everybody wants to know more. As I mentioned earlier, the different types of topics that we're going to be studying or studying already are just massive. It's a broad list. And everybody from Indo-PACOM and U.S. Army Pacific, they all have their own desire for more information on topics anywhere from national security strategy to campaigns and other types of things to support that Chinese effort in future conflicts. So it really depends on who's asking. If General Flynn wants to know something more about the Chinese military that we can write on, we're going to get after that. Whether or not the Indo-Pacific commander wants to know more or his staff wants to know more, we will go after those as well. I maintain a really good relationship with a lot of folks in theater, but so does Colonel Butler. We both have very extensive backgrounds working with the folks out there. So it's a lot easier for us to ask those people directly, what is your boss asking for? What do you need to know more about? And ultimately, it also is based on what we have available organically here in the center. So the researchers that we brought on board and are bringing on board, all Chinese language enabled, are going to be digging after each of those topics, whether it be additional stuff to talk about protracted warfare, which we'll get after with our conference, which later is going to be discussed.
So tell me a little bit more about how you organize this. Are there any themes that you work on?
We wanted a theme that would cross the year, recognizing we had a relatively broad portfolio. And that broad portfolio, you don't get that done in 1 year. That's a multi-year look. We got a few key insights early on that allowed us to decide that the first year theme was going to be protracted war, mostly because we've been used to fighting short, sharp wars. That's a lot of how our force structure has been built on the American side and how we think about wars over the last 30 years since Gulf War I. And we think that there's utility in studying that based on Chinese doctrine, force structure, and build, and what type of war do they think they could expect if they tried to seize key and decisive terrain, say, in a place like Taiwan. And that, in turn, feeds a better understanding of both deterring and assuring. The other thing, we sourced through and met with all of our key stakeholders and worked with the other PME institutions in places like the Asia Studies Detachment in Japan that does a lot of open source intelligence work for us, for the entire military community. I started seeing a few interesting common things. Number one was if we didn't work across the intelligence, strategy, planning, and operations lanes, we wouldn't get a complete picture. Because a lot of the questions we were getting related to, is what we're doing in the military lane effective? That's a really easy question to ask. But when you're talking about strategic deterrence and trying to avoid conflict by being strong in the right places with the right things and sending the right signals and getting the right reflected return, that's very, very hard. And it requires sort of an all-source intel effort, and it requires everybody who's doing the analysis to understand what were we doing and what did we intend to do. So we think that's a big long-term pull that we can sort of help with across the community of interest.
As far as the protracted warfare theme, this is a big topic because if people decide, hey, I want to do some research on Chinese protracted warfare, they're just going to get a ton of Google hits on Mao Zedong. speeches and everything that were compiled years ago. The fact of the matter is, reading Chinese campaign strategy and other types of military strategy, it's a topic they don't like to talk about, just like we don't like to talk about it. And so as their military remains prepared for some kind of large-scale conflict, I think it's important, and Colonel Butler called it out, it's important for the warfighters and policymakers to understand what their level of preparedness is and how they think about it. And I think it's a great topic because it sets the foundation for everything else we're going to be getting after for the next couple of years.
How can practitioners and researchers participate in your work? Do you accept work from outside sources?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. Colonel Butler and I both like to talk to folks in theater if they have topics that are relevant to Indo-Pacific or even Chinese military operations or Korean or anybody that operates within that theater. I think there is relevance in that we can publish very concise pieces or even some longer monograph style pieces that discuss everything from Chinese security strategy or land domain strategies. Ultimately, when I go out and talk to folks I'm teaching, I readily put on my Colonel Butler hat and say, hey, look, if you guys have something that you want the practitioners to know and it is relevant to our center, we can do this. Just make sure it's properly sourced and it's relevant. And that's the big key to me.
I put Josh's hat on every once in a while and say, it's just the right thing. Does it fit within the mandate of the center? And there's a few things that we're learning. Number one, there's a broad swath of inquiry out there. And some of it neatly fits into the direction we're going from the lens of what's the adversary doing? What does Blue need to understand about that? And why is it important? What should we do with our allies and partners? But we're also a conduit to connect with other places. If it's not a nice fit for us, we can probably direct it to another publishing location. We're very interested in things that are useful for strategic leaders and practitioners, not just peer-reviewed academic material. That does have its place as well, and we're interested in it. But the world is moving at a faster rate, and the common understanding and vision that we need to get collectively has to happen at a more rapid rate. When we stood up the center, we started making relatively quick decisions with the support of Major General Hill, the commandant here, and Dr. Carol Evans, our boss at the Strategic Studies Institute, that we would have our own website, we have publishing authorities for things that are useful, that we would run our own podcast, that would be tied to social media, that would be actively engaging and learning and drawing from the PME centers at the other war colleges and other places. I already mentioned the Asia Studies Detachment in Zama, Japan, as well as other think tanks and places where this type of thought goes on, where we're starting at the operational level and reaching up to the strategic level and explaining, here's the problem, here's some recommendations to get to a better solution. So we maintain the peace while being prepared to win if we have to go to war. Those are all very salient things that we're just slowly starting to get after. And we'll get better because by the end of summer, we'll actually have our full complement of people and we'll continue shifting and being a team player. This is all a team sport. This can't be done by just 6 of us here or the 25 people at the Strategic Studies Institute or the entirety of the faculty staff at the Army War College. It's really an expansive number of people that goes into making sure these recommendations have solvency.
And I just wanted to touch on the second part of that question about the educational process. We are also a conduit for the Army War College. And if there are experts out there and practitioners that believe some lessons they have could be relevant to students here on campus, we can make those connections as well. So as Colonel Butler mentioned, we can connect them for publication purposes, or, hey, look, if you want to help teach or you have something important that they should be aware of, please let us know, reach out. And again, if it's something that might be podcast worthy, we have a lot of capabilities to make sure that relevant information is getting out to the right people.
To add to the idea that this is a team process, one of the things I'll bring up is Josh led a 2-week course bringing people together from across the department to teach foreign area officers and some strategists about how the Chinese were doing strategic competition in the security sector, both in the traditional military lane and the non-traditional military lane. And that had a lot of resonance because it's an education piece that our foreign area officers and our strategists and people that deal with the PLA and other host nations out in the Indo-Pacific or around the world actually need to know to do their job. That's part of keeping the peace. It's part of deterrence. It's part of assurance. And it was just a great effort by a team of teams to pull this all together and make it happen for the senior leadership of the Army that was asking for it.
So the website where everyone can find you, ssi.armywarcollege.edu/CLSC, or just internet search China Landpower Study Center. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we're up on social media. We're on Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn now.
What else would you like people to know about the China Landpower Study Center?
We do maintain close relationships with the rest of the PME institutes, as well as TRADOC. Army's Training and Doctrine Command has its own set of China experts that we work very closely with as well. They like to look at a bit more of the tactical stuff where we get to a bit more of the operational and strategic levels. But we're part of a new set of people that are really looking at an important topic that's only going to get more important over the next few years. And I'm really happy to have received Rich's support and our boss, Carol Evans' support in finding a really stellar team that will be on site. So please look for some really great stuff in the coming months.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line for me is that, just like Josh was saying, we want to be approachable. We're small, which means we can't turn super fast sometimes. We're learning every single day, and we're looking forward to being a contributor. We want to be in that ring helping solve these problems.
Listeners, you can read the article at press.armywarcollege.edu/parameters. Look for Volume 54, Issue 1. For more Army War College podcasts, check out Conversations on Strategy, SSI Live, and A Better Peace.